afternoon. It's been just about a year since the last time I was here for services, so as some of you said, you sort of suspected it was about time that I show up again. So it always is very special to get down here. Appreciate the years that we spent down in this vicinity, down 10 years that we spent just almost exactly living here in South Louisiana. Things have been going well across the area, across the region. I had opportunity just for services of meeting a man who had recently been baptized here in this congregation. That's very nice. I baptized a lady in Dallas this past week, and we had several baptisms up in Arkansas just in the 2 or 3 weeks prior to that. Things seem to be moving pretty well. I was up in Arkansas in Little Rock and Russellville this past Sabbath. I sort of directly pastor the areas there in North Texas and Arkansas, and then sort of travel through the rest of the region where we have, of course, other pastors, Mr. McNair down here, and on over further to the east, Mr. Hall, Mr. Coburnaut, and Mr. Faulkner over through Mississippi and Alabama and Florida, Georgia, parts of South Carolina, and then Mr. Keith Walden down in South Texas. So anyway, my wife and I we're going to be here just for the weekend. We're going to go back home Sunday night because I have a trip coming up through West Texas next week to visit our little video groups out there. We have 3 video groups in West Texas, and so I've got Bible studies out there Tuesday night in Abilene, Wednesday night in Midland, and Thursday night in Amarillo, and then have Sabbath services Friday night in Oklahoma City, and be in Dallas and Gladewater next Sabbath. So I think I'll need a calendar to figure out where I am here the coming week. We'll sort of blurs by. But you know, once you get out in West Texas, I mean, what they've got in West Texas is just miles and miles of miles and miles. And so once you get out there, you might as well just make the whole sweep, because otherwise you spend all your time going and coming. So we're looking forward much to seeing the brethren out there in those areas. Things are, I think, moving along well as far as the work overall is concerned. And excitement is building up about the ministerial conference. It's coming up in March. That'll be the first full conference we've had in San Diego for several years. I believe 96 was the last year we did that. So that'll be very nice to have a chance to get everyone together. Well, brethren, we're living in times that are not simply normal times. As you look around at what's going on in the world, you look around at things that are happening in Europe, you look around at things that are happening in the Middle East, and you realize that there are certain pressures and tensions that are building. And our attention is drawn to some of these events. Things particularly in Europe, one of the things that has not received a lot of attention, there's been a fair amount of attention given to the new government in Austria. What has not been mentioned is the fact that every other government in Europe right now is a socialist government. That's one of the reasons for their great antagonism, because their economies are sluggish, their taxation is high, there is a growing discontent and dissatisfaction in the populations of many of the European countries, and certain problems that are building up. And they're all very nervous because they're afraid that this swing to the right is going to result in the ouster of many of those governments and their replacement with something else. It's going to be interesting to see as the situation develops over there and as some of the tensions build. Coupled with that, of course, have been recent events in the Middle East. If you remember, just a short time ago, in response to the deaths of some Israeli soldiers, Israel struck to the point that they knocked out the electricity virtually in the entire nation of Syria. I mean, they knocked all the power plants out, and Syria went dark for several days, really, before they were able to get much back online, and they're still not. They'll be months before they get those things fixed. Well, shortly after then, Syrian-backed guerrillas launched an attack that killed another Israeli soldier. And Israel, at that point, walked out of the peace talks, and they said, we're going to make the ground burn over here. So they haven't done it yet. They're letting the Lebanese and the Syrians sort of anticipate what's going to happen, and just be uncomfortable sort of looking up at the sky and wondering when something is going to strike, because they know that it is. There is a pressure and a tension that is building in the Middle East. There's a pressure and a tension that is building in Europe. There are things that are building all over the world. And as we see these things, and as we see the events of Bible prophecy, it is important that we take note, and we're all interested in those sorts of things. I want to call your attention here in the book of 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul was dealing with some things, and he gives us a key if we want to understand, if you're interested in knowing exactly where are we right now in the sequence of Bible prophecy. Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 1, Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto Him, that you be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. You see, Paul did not teach the rapture doctrine. He didn't teach that, Christ may just come back any minute, any second, just there. No, he said, now don't be troubled. He'd been talking about the return of Christ, but he said, it's not going to just happen tomorrow. Verse 3, Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, the one who exalts and who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God. Now, Paul brought out two things that would occur, that would begin a sequence. The first is a falling away. The Greek word is apostasia. It's the word we get our English word apostasy, a departure from the truth. That day shall not come except there come an apostasy, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. Now, there have been many men of sin, individuals who, by their actions, by their behavior, and by their teachings, promoted sin. There have been many wicked ones. The Apostle Paul talks on down in verse 8 about that wicked one. Then shall that wicked one be revealed, the one that the Lord will consume with the spirit of His mouth and destroy with the brightness of His coming. You see, Paul makes it plain. He's not talking about just any wicked one. There have been many men of sin. There have been many wicked ones down through the centuries. He is talking about a specific individual, a specific wicked one, a specific man of sin. The individual, that final false prophet, the one, verse 9, whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. An individual who will do great, miraculous things on the world scene. You see, the system that was going to produce this individual was already at work. Paul said that in verse 5. He says, when I was with you, I told you these things. You know what withholds, that He might be revealed in His time. The mystery of iniquity does already work. That whole system, the mystery religion that advocated and taught lawlessness, was already at work. That system had already begun to function. But things were being restrained. He who now let, this is let in the Old English sense, that means to restrain. Now restrained, will continue to restrain until He's taken out of the way, or until He emerged, till He come up from the midst. You see, the system that would produce this final wicked one was already at work. But things would restrain until the right time. God is right on time. The disciples asked Christ right before He ascended to heaven. They said, Lord, will You at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They wanted to know when. You and I had been there, chances are we'd ask the same thing. Are we there yet? And Christ said, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has reserved into His own power. You see, the Father has reserved certain things to Himself. And the times, the time sequence, the time schedule is something that the Father has reserved. Now, the Father's has revealed the time sequence. It was a revelation that He gave through Jesus Christ that was given to the Apostle John and is laid out in the book of Revelation. You remember when Christ went to open the seals of the book of Revelation? The whole book is sealed with the 7 seals. And they're opened sequentially, one at a time. Some may be in very close time sequence. Others may be a little further apart. The first seal that is opened, what happens? A rider comes forth on a white horse. Christ interpreted that in Matthew 24 to be false prophets. This is exactly what Paul brings out here. The first seal is this, when the first seal is opened, that is when this final wicked one, this man of sin, the specific man of sin that will be destroyed by Christ at His return. So all the people that have maybe been suggested down through time, well, maybe it's so-and-so, maybe it's so-and-so. If they're dead, it's not them. Because they're going to have to be alive to be destroyed by Christ at His return. It is an individual that is going to, it is the individual that is designated in the book of Revelation, the false prophet. The one who, together with this emerging military political leader in Europe, will stand atop a system that will dominate the world. This final wicked one, this final man of sin, this false prophet who will perform great signs and lying wonders. We're told in the book of Matthew, chapter 24, Jesus Christ said some of those signs would be so impressive. They would be so impressive that if it were possible, even the very elect would be deceived. They would be remarkable. Revelation 13 describes this system, this false prophet working signs and wonders, miracles in the sight of the beast, to cause everyone on earth to give their loyalty and their allegiance to the beast power. Now, the sequence is, if you want to know where we are in prophecy, right at the comma in verse 3. That's pretty exact, isn't it? There shall come a falling away first. I find it very hard to believe that there could be a falling away on a grander scale than what we've experienced in the last few years. We have seen a massive apostasy. There's come a falling away first, comma. And that man of sin will be revealed, the son of perdition. Now, that hasn't happened yet. So, that's where we are, right at the comma. A lot of things happening in the world around. A lot of things building. And there is going to come on the scene, and we don't know. You know, anyone can look and see that the Pope is in pretty frail health. He has various health problems. He's going to disappear from the scene in the relatively near future. We don't know exactly. Obviously, no one does. But you can look and see that he's not going to be around long. Now, is the man that takes his place going to play a significant role? Is he going to play this role? Or is he simply going to sort of be in the spot for a period of time, sort of hold the place, as it were, and then disappear and yet another successor? But you know it's coming. The wicked one will be revealed. This final man of sin, this final individual atop that system, the Babylonian mystery religion, is going to emerge. And when the white horse, when the first seal is opened and the white horse rides, the other horsemen are right behind. And the time is going to come when these things are going to happen, and they're going to happen in such a remarkably rapid fashion. We are in sort of a transition time. We're in a period of time where we're in that time of transition from the post-World War II order until that final order that will be dominated by a military political leader in Europe who is in alliance with this religious leader. Now, we don't know how long this transition period is going to last. But when God's time comes, things will happen and can happen with such rapidity that it will make people just marvel and shake their heads. It's going to catch the world by surprise. Those of you who remember back to the events in Europe in the fall of 1989, you remember how the world was completely taken by surprise. They were amazed at what happened, and just in a matter of weeks, the whole post-World War II order collapsed. Germany was reunited. The communist governments collapsed like dominoes, just one at a time. The Berlin Wall came down. The whole post-World War II order passed from the scene. We're in that transition stage that will produce the final order of man's 6,000 years of human government. Brethren, as we find ourselves in this transition time, it is apparent and it is important that we reflect on the warnings that are specifically given us as the church. Because when these things began to unfold, Christ said there are going to come things. He talked about if it were possible, the very elect would be deceived. You know why they won't be? It says right here in 2 Thessalonians 2. It talks about, in verse 9, this individual who's working signs and lying wonders through the power of Satan. And in verse 10 it says, with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. Received not the love of the truth. Because those who love the truth hold to it, cling to it. Christ talked about in Matthew 24 a time would come when many would be deceived. He was talking to the disciples. He said, many will be deceived. And he talked about many being offended and even coming to hate one another and betray one another when all of this tremendous pressure is brought to bear in the events that lead up to the tribulation. And he talked about the love of many growing cold. And then he said, he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world for a witness, then shall the end come. Christ warned about love growing cold. He warned about people becoming offended. He warned about people becoming deceived. We read these warnings, whether in Matthew 24 or here in 2 Thessalonians 2 or other places, we read these warnings and, none of us want to be in the wrong category. When you and I read the accounts back in the Old Testament and we read about events during the time of the Exodus and of Moses, or we read about events during the time of the kings of Israel and Judah, we always identify with the good guys. When Elijah was just depressed and he felt like, he said, Lord, I'm the only one left. I'm the only one that cares. The only one that's still faithful. And God said, no, it's not quite that bad. There are yet 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Now, if you look at the population of Israel being several million, 7,000 wasn't a very big percentage. But nevertheless, he said, there were yet some that were still faithful. Now we read that and we look at that example and we think, well, I'd have been one of those. We all want to be. We desire to be. Brethren, the category that you and I fit in, the things that are going to happen in the years ahead, all comes down to the answer to one question. It all comes down to the answer to one question. And that question is, what do you love the most? What do you love the most? You know, a lot of people love a lot of things. The Bible talks about that, and it talks about the things that attract the affection of people. And there, as I say, a number of different things. In 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul is writing Timothy, and he talks about, down in verse 7 of 1 Timothy 6, he says, "We brought nothing into this world, and it's certain that we can carry nothing out. Having food and raiment, let us therewith be content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root." That's the proper rendering. It's not the only root, but it is a root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they've erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. He goes on down and he says, told Timothy in verse 17, he says, "Charge them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. That they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, ready to communicate or to share, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life." Now, Paul talked here about the love of money, and he said the love of money is a root of all evil. There's virtually nothing you can think of that people haven't done for money. People have committed murder for money. They've committed adultery. They've lied. They've stolen. They've cheated. They have betrayed their country. They have betrayed people that, maybe even family members, close friends, people that loved them and trusted them. People have done, there are individuals who have done virtually anything that you can imagine for money. See, the love of money is a root of all evil. It's not the only root from which evil can grow, but it is a root from which every sort of evil imaginable has come. Now, the problem is those who trust in the uncertain riches. You see, Paul says in verse 17, charge those that are rich in this world, and charge those that have more, that have abundance, that are rich in this world. What? That they be not high-minded, not to look down on others, not to put their trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who's the one who gives us richly all things to enjoy. You see, God is the one who is our source of security. The reason people get in trouble here, one of the things that entices people to money, is the fact that it's viewed as a source of security, a source of protection. That will take care of them. And Paul brings out that the riches of this age are uncertain. Thieves break in and steal. Moth and rust does corrupt. You can have all sorts of things. Physical things can deteriorate and do. There is only one source of security, and that's the living God, the one, whatever it is we have that we enjoy, whatever benefits, whatever things that we have in this life, it all came from God. He's the one you put your trust in. But people get caught up in the pursuit of money. And it gets them into various problems, various difficulties. Back in Matthew chapter 13. Matthew 13 and verse 22. Christ is talking about different categories of those who receive the truth. And in Matthew 13:22, he says, "He also that receives seed among the thorns is he that hears the word, and the care of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful." So here's an individual that becomes choked out, does not grow and produce bear fruit in his life. Why? Well, the cares of this life and the deceitfulness of riches sort of choke it out. They crowd it out. You know, anybody that's ever planted a garden understands the analogy that's being described here. And it's amazing. You know, if you plant something that's of value, you have to take care of it by weeding the garden. I've never seen tomatoes come up and choke out all the weeds. But somehow the weeds and the grass can come up and choke out the tomatoes. You ever notice how life seems to work that way? It doesn't take any effort on your part for the wrong things to just sort of sprout up and choke out. And somehow then there's no time left over for the things of God. He talks here about the deceitfulness of riches. An illusion of security. An illusion that somehow the individual has protected himself. Well, the only source of protection is God. People have done all sorts of things trying to protect themselves, and sometimes it's blown up in their faces, and in some cases literally. You heard about the guy back in December was all worried about Y2K, and he had gotten him a big generator, and he didn't want to run out of gasoline. You know, generator doesn't do you any good if you don't have fuel for it, right? And so he had gallons and gallons of fuel. He had it all stored out there, and somehow something set off one of them, and it just blew up and blew the whole place away. Now, he was trying to protect himself. He thought he was going to be taken care of. But it was uncertain. You and I can't totally protect ourselves. We have to realize that. We can do things you can do. But if a big enough storm comes, a big enough hurricane comes, it just blows it all away. Fire comes, thief breaks in, earthquake comes, whatever it may be, tornado sets down. There are so many things that are beyond our ability to control. The point is that for some, the pursuit of wealth is their God. That's what they love the most. The love of money is a root from which every sort of evil can flow. There are so many examples you can go to of individuals whose lives were ruled by the pursuit, the acquisition of material things. And that's what they loved. That's what they wanted. And, you know, one example is back in 2 Kings 5. I'll just tell the story for the sake of time. That's the story of where Naaman, the Syrian general, came down to Elisha to be healed because he had leprosy. You remember the story. Naaman was a Syrian general. He had leprosy. And there was a little girl, Israelite girl, that had been taken captive by the Syrians in an earlier raid. And she was a little maidservant working there in the house of this Syrian general. And she felt compassion for her master. And she told her mistress one day, she said, you know, I wish the master were in Israel, where I come from, because there's a prophet of God there that could heal him. Well, that was the first hope that anybody had held out to them. The lady talked to her husband, and he went to the king and said, you know, I understand that there's a prophet in Israel that could maybe heal me of this disease. And the king said, well, that's good, you know. I'll write a letter to the king of Israel, and we'll send you down there. Well, he wrote a letter to the king of Israel. The king of Israel got upset when he got the letter because he was not an individual of faith. In fact, he was the son of Ahab and Jezebel, so he was a real chip off the old block. He got the letter down there, and he says, what's this guy trying to do? Send me his servant to be healed of leprosy? He's just trying to pick a fight. He's just looking for an excuse to attack me. What can I do? Elisha heard about it, sent word, and he says, you send him to me. Then he'll know, and you'll know, that there's a God in Israel. Well, Naaman came up there where Elisha was, and Elisha didn't come out of the house. He sent his servant Gehazi out of the house. And Gehazi came out there and told Naaman, he said, the servant of God says that you need to go over there to the Jordan River and wash 7 times. Well, you talk about being upset. Naaman was upset. That was not at all like he had imagined. Have you ever anticipated something and you sort of had it figured out in your mind how it was going to work out? You could just sort of imagine, you know, it was almost like you had written the script. You had it all figured out, and you were waiting and things happened, but it didn't happen at all the way you had it figured out to happen. Naaman said, well, I thought he would come out, and he would call upon the name of his God, and he would do all of this stuff. Naaman had been thinking about this. You could just see wheels had been turning in his head all the way down. He could just imagine, this great impressive ceremony and the man of God coming out there and confronting him. You could just sort of see, the thunder roll and the lightning flash and very great dramatic scene. And he would wave his arms and call on the name of his God and this great impressive ceremony. And it didn't happen like that at all. He sent his servant out and he said, you need to go take a bath. Go down there to the Jordan River and bathe 7 times. And Naaman said, we got better rivers than that back where I come from. If I need to take a bath, I don't need to go in that old muddy river. Well, he was mad. He was ready to just go home. And one of his servants came to him and said, look, what if the prophet had asked you to do something hard? What if he had asked you to do something really difficult as a criteria to you being healed? Would you have done it? Oh, well, yeah, sure. I've tried that. Climb the highest mountain, swim the swiftest river, do something really dramatic. Well, I guess I'd have tried that. Well, he didn't ask you to do something hard. He just asked you to do something simple, easy. Why don't you do that? And so Naaman did. And it's interesting what it says. Somebody could have bottled that. They'd have made a fortune because you told that Naaman, when he dipped 7 times, he came up and it said his flesh came upon him new, like the flesh of a little child. So not only did he get rid of the leprosy, he got rid of the wrinkles. That was potent stuff. Well, he was so excited he didn't know what to do. You can just imagine. Now, you know what it took for him to go down in that Jordan River? Because everybody's up there watching. See all of his servants that he's brought up. It took faith and courage and humility. Because wouldn't he have felt foolish if he'd gotten down there in the Jordan and nothing had happened? All these folks up there watching, then they'd have begun to snicker and laugh. And the stories they would have told on him when he got back home. Those things had to go through his mind. He had to step out in faith to obey. It took humility to do something that was not some great, grand, impressive thing. It was a very humble thing, a simple thing. Well, God healed him, and he came back. He came back, and he was so excited. And he wanted to give all of these expensive gifts to Elisha. Well, Elisha talked to him, and he wouldn't accept the gifts. God's blessings and benefits are not for sale. He wouldn't accept the gifts, but they had a good conversation. Naaman left to go back to Syria. And Gehazi, Elisha's servant, was standing out there watching all of this. And he saw the gold, and he saw the silver, and he saw the expensive apparel. And it bothered him to see those things hauled off back to Syria. So Gehazi waited for a little while until Naaman had taken off and Elisha had gone back in. And next thing you know, here's Gehazi running down the road. And somebody sees him, and Naaman pulls up his chariot and stops and goes back here. What's wrong? And Gehazi says, right after you left, a couple of fellows showed up there at Elisha's residence, a couple of sons of the prophets, and they were really destitute and hard up. We didn't have anything to give them. And Elisha thought that maybe, some of that stuff you had, I could just sort of carry it back and we'd be able to provide for them. Well, Naaman said, sure, I'll be glad to give it to you. In fact, he took 2 servants, gave Gehazi more than he asked for, took 2 of his servants and sent them to haul it back. They got back and Gehazi said, you can just put it over here in my house. I'll take care of it. A little later, Gehazi went in before Elisha, and Elisha said, well, Gehazi, where you been? Oh, nowhere, just sort of, right here at the house. Hadn't gone anywhere. And Elisha said, don't tell me that. I know exactly where you've been. You went down there to Naaman and you brought silver and gold back. You wanted that money, didn't you? Said the leprosy of Naaman is going to cling to you. And Gehazi became a leper from that moment forward. Here was a man that had seen a tremendous miracle. In fact, he'd seen many miracles as you go back and read the account in 1 Kings. He was right there with Elisha. He saw Elisha raise the dead son of the lady there where Elisha had stayed many times. Saw Elisha raise from the dead her little son. He had seen remarkable miracles time after time. But you know, Gehazi loved money. And the love of money led him to do a very foolish thing. It led him to lie, to steal, to try to deceive Naaman, to try to deceive Elisha. It led him to do all sorts of things because, you see, somehow physical silver and gold was more real to him than the God of heaven. Now, there are those who love money the most. There are others who simply love this present world. They're in love with the world, and they don't want to turn loose of it. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, here is Paul near the end of his life. He is in prison in Rome. And he writes to Timothy, the last letter that Paul wrote, that we have record of in the New Testament, 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6. He says, I'm now ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I've kept the faith. There's henceforth laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but to all them also that love His appearing. Do your diligence to come shortly unto me. Verse 10, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed to Thessalonica, Crispus to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia, only Luke is with me. Now, if you go back to the book of Colossians, you go back to the book of Philemon, you read about Demas. Demas, Paul describes in those books as my fellow laborer. Demas was an individual that traveled with Paul, that was with Paul, that spent time there, that heard Paul preach and teach, that saw all sorts of things take place over a period of years. Demas was a close companion, called by Paul my fellow laborer. Paul is now in prison. As people would look at it, from a human standpoint, it seems like everything is falling apart. Paul is awaiting execution. There are terrible things that have taken toll on the church. Demas, Paul said, has forsaken me, having loved this present world. You know, Demas was there as a part of things for years, but he never got the love of the world out of his heart. And so when it appeared that things weren't going so well in the church, Demas went back to what he loved the most. And what he loved was this present world. He wanted to fit in. He wanted to be a part of it. He wanted to be accepted by it. He identified with this world because in reality it was his world. That was where his loyalty and his affection really lay. He loved this present world. 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15. The Apostle John writes, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but it's of the world. The world passes away, and the lust thereof, but he that does the will of God abides forever. There is a new world coming that is going to be permanent. A new world coming that's going to endure. This present world, this society, is going to pass from the scene. This society is based on the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those are the underlying values that motivate this society. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. So much of modern advertising is simply built on these things. That's because those who write the ads know that's what works. That's what appeals to people. That's why if they're selling anything from automobiles to airplane flights, they can have some scantily clad girl out there, and somehow, she's right there. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, pride of life. Those are the motivating factors. You see, what does our world revolve around? We want to fit in with, we want to be accepted by, or we want to be part and parcel of this world, this age, this society. We're going to have to choose which world we love. Because if we love this present world, then ultimately we'll cling to it. We'll hold to the wrong values. There's always been the temptation to the people of God down through the centuries. There are two ways Satan works on the church. And you can go all the way back from Genesis on. There are basically two ways. One is through enticement and attraction. And the other is through intimidation and coercion. First, there is the allure, the enticement that the world holds out. Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom, we're told. Pick it up a couple of chapters later, and he's moved it in Sodom. And he's right there. Now, Lot didn't totally get sucked into what was going on, but his children did. His wife did. She just couldn't quite turn her back and walk away. She was changed to a pillar of salt. One of the short verses of the Bible. Jesus' reminder, remember Lot's wife. 3 words. Remember Lot's wife. You see, Lot's wife loved that present world. And when the judgment of God came on that society, she was unable to turn her back and walk away from it because that was her world. And she just couldn't quite turn loose of it. What about us, brethren? Where was Lot on his way to? He was on his way to the place of safety. He was on his way to the place of protection, to be spared the wrath and the judgment that God was going to allow to come on Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot left. We're told in the New Testament, we're told by Peter that he was just Lot. When you read the account in Genesis, you realize he was just barely just Lot. Just barely. And Mrs. Lot wasn't. The love of the world. The siren song, to look back, to cling, to hold on. That test is going to come on every one of us. Which world do we love? The world to come or this present evil age? Which set of values do we identify with? Because there's one set of values that is going to pass from the scene. They're not going to endure. The world to come is not going to be based on the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. It's going to be based on a totally different set of values. Now let's go on. Let's look a little further. Other things people love. People can love money. They can love this present world. 3 John, verse 9. The Apostle John writes about a man who loved to have the preeminence. He loved power and position. John says in 3 John verse 9, he said, I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, receives us not. Diotrephes loved the preeminence. He liked power and position. He wanted to be in charge. As Diotrephes looked at it, the Apostle John was getting up pretty old. He was elderly. He was up in his 90s. And John wasn't going to be around much longer. Diotrephes, he was maneuvering and moving and sort of trying to position himself for control. Diotrephes loved to have the preeminence. That was what he wanted. You know, Christ talked about the Pharisees that way in Matthew 23. He said they were hypocrites, play actors. They loved the greetings in the marketplace. They loved the positions of power and control and authority. You know, the Pharisees weren't interested in the things that would really have helped and built others. They wanted control. They wanted power. It's interesting, back in Numbers chapter 16, familiar story, the story of Korah and Dathan and Abiram. Now, it's interesting what Korah said. Korah was, of course, a Levite. He was a cousin of Moses. And Korah had, together with his friends Dathan and Abiram, had stirred up a number of people. Numbers 16:2. They rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown, men who were well known. They gathered themselves together before against Moses and against Aaron, and said unto them, You take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord's among them. Wherefore then lift you yourselves up above the congregation of the Lord. When Moses heard it, he fell on his face. Moses heard about that, and he went before God and just really fell on his face before God. But what was he being accused of? See, they had been stirring, Korah and his crowd had been stirring up trouble. Yeah, you know, Moses just wants to be in charge. Why, the whole congregation is holy. Everybody. Shouldn't be somebody in charge here. Now, let me ask you something. If Korah had won, who do you think Korah would have had in mind to be in charge? He was accusing Moses. He said, you know, you're just trying to make yourself a prince. You've lifted yourself up above the congregation. If you come on down here, Moses sent word for Dathan and Abiram, verse 12, to come up there. He wanted to talk to them. Now, they were a couple of smart alecks. They sent word back, we're not coming. We're not coming. We don't have to listen to you. Verse 13, Is it a small thing that you've brought us up out of a land that flows with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness, except you make yourself altogether a prince over us? You've not brought us into a land that flows with milk and honey. You've not given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. You're going to put out the eyes of these men. We will not come up. Now, notice how they had rewritten history. Notice the accusation. They said, You brought us up out of a land that flows with milk and honey. You brought us away from a good place. You know, Egypt was pretty nice. Had a lot of food back there. You brought us away from that, and you promised us. You promised us if we followed you, you'd lead us to a land of milk and honey, and you haven't brought it. You have not given us an inheritance there. Moses, you've lied. You've misrepresented things. Well, had Moses led them into the promised land yet? Had he promised them the promised land? Yes. But what's the rest of the story? Well, just a few chapters earlier, he brought them up to the promised land. They sent the spies in. The spies came back and said, Yes, it's a land that flows with milk and honey, but there are giants in the land. We can't possess it. And the people's hearts sort of melted like water. All the faith went away. And God said, All right, you're going to wander 40 years in the wilderness. Now, you see, they didn't tell the whole story. They accused Moses. They imputed motives. They accused him of having brought him out there to kill him. And then they say, Not only have you done all this, you hadn't done what you promised. You brought us out here to kill us. Now you're making yourself a prince over us. Now, brethren, if Moses had wanted to be a prince, all he had to do was stay in Egypt. Moses was a prince in Egypt before any of this stuff ever started. If Moses wanted to be a prince, all he had to do was stay where he was. Moses wasn't the one that wanted to be a prince. Moses had proven that he was prepared to walk away, forsake all of the treasures of Egypt. And Moses had lived for 40 years as a shepherd in the wilderness, herding his father-in-law's sheep. And at the age of 80, God appeared to him in a burning bush and said, Moses, I've got a job for you. I want you to go back to Egypt and bring my people out. Moses wasn't the one that coveted being a prince. They wanted to be a prince. I remember years ago I was a student at Ambassador College, and I can still vividly remember the time and the place there. It was a Bible study on a Friday evening in the gymnasium there in Pasadena. Mr. Armstrong was giving Bible study, and as Mr. Armstrong was wont to do, he would maybe have a subject he was going through, but he would get off on sort of a digression, and then sometimes he would digress from the digression, and sometimes those were the things you got the most from. And I remember that particular evening. I don't remember the rest of the subject, don't remember how he got off on it, but he made a point. He said, I've noticed over the years of my life that most of the people who go around accusing others are generally guilty of the very thing they accuse. They're often the ones who have the motives that they accuse others of having. And I thought about that and observed and looked over the years since, and it's interesting how often that really is the case. Korah and Dathan and Abiram accused Moses of the very attitudes and motives they themselves had. They were the ones that wanted to be in charge. They were the ones who loved the preeminence. They were jealous and resentful of Moses. And they accused Moses. Having brought him out there to tell him. Accused Moses of wanting to be a prince. Accused Moses of wanting to lord it over everyone. That wasn't Moses' attitude. The man Moses, was the meekest man in all the earth. That's what God said about him. God knows the hearts of all men. I don't think anybody ever accused Korah of being the meekest man in all the earth. Nobody ever accused Dathan and Abiram of being the meekest men in all the earth. They accused Moses. Diotrephes. You wonder the things Diotrephes loved to have the preeminence. He was even putting people out of the church, trying to grab total control and power. Don't you think Diotrephes had some accusations against these people? Don't you think he was accusing them and imputing false motives? Of course he was. The Pharisees, who love to have the preeminence. They love power and control. So there are people who love money. There are people who are in love with this present world. There are others who love power and control. There are other things people love. Some people love to be popular. They want to be popular. They want to be accepted. They love the praise of men. That's really what they desire. John chapter 12. In verse 42, nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him, believed on Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. That was what was important to them. They wanted to be accepted. They wanted to be popular. They loved the praise of men, and it meant more to them than the praise of God. When you go back to John chapters 2 and 3, the very beginning of Christ's ministry is described. Christ's first public appearance in Jerusalem after the onset of his ministry. He had been baptized by John the Baptist in the fall and chose the disciples. He was in the wilderness for 40 days of fasting and his temptation by Satan. He had been in Cana for the wedding feast, and now he came down to Jerusalem just prior to the Passover. Just prior to the Passover of 28 A.D. That is the story of how Jesus walked into the temple there prior to the Passover, and he cleansed the temple. He cast out the money changers. They had set up shop in there where they were if you remember the story, they had, in the outer courtyard of the temple, which was the court of the Gentiles, they had set up shop. They were selling the sacrificial animals. Now, that was a pretty lucrative market. You know, people came in from afar. They couldn't bring their sheep or goat with them. They brought money. Well, they came there to the temple to participate. Here they were for Passover. And so they all needed to buy lambs for Passover. They needed to buy various animals for sacrifice. But you know, the animal to be offered for sacrifice had to be without spot or blemish. Who decided whether it was without spot or blemish? The priest did. So, if you went down the road to Joe's goat farm and were going to buy yours, he sort of was a little more competitive with the price. If that priest looked long enough and hard enough, he could probably find a spot somewhere. So the only safe place to buy your animal was right there, because they had already passed inspection. Of course, you had to pay double price. They had a monopoly on the market, but they weren't content just to sell the animals at inflated prices and to force people to have to buy from them rather than someone else. That wasn't enough. You see, what did people have in their pockets when they showed up, all these Jews from all over the Roman Empire? What did they have in their pockets? They had Roman money. And guess whose picture was on the Roman money? Well, Caesar's picture was on there. And the priest said, oh, that will never do. We can't put that old pagan money in the temple treasury. Oh, no, that's got Caesar's picture on there, and it's got, idolatrous titles and symbols. We can't allow that to go in the temple treasury. We've got this table over here, and this is a money changer table. You can take that old pagan money and put it in the pot, and we'll give you a temple shekel in exchange. Of course, the Roman coin had an ounce of silver, and the temple shekel had about 2/3 of an ounce. 30% wasn't a bad profit. So first they clipped you on the money, then they clipped you on the animals. They had quite a racket going. One day, just before the Passover, sort of out of nowhere, Jesus Christ strode into the temple. We're told that he plaited some cords into a whip. And the first thing anybody noticed was these corral gates where the sheep and the oxen and the goats were penned up. Somebody knocked down the corral gates. That's what Jesus did, and then he popped the whip. Now, if you've ever been to the auction barn and seen cattle running through the chute, you know what it looked like within a matter of moments. There were goats and cattle and sheep trying like everything to get through all these little narrow gateways. They were just all this commotion. You can just imagine. Then you knock over the doves' cages, you open those up, and you got thousands of birds all over the place. You throw over the money changers' tables, and they're down there groveling trying to get the money. Had quite a scene there. Christ said, get this stuff out of here. My Father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all people, and you've made it a den of thieves. Get this stuff out of here. Well, needless to say, he got a lot of attention in a real big hurry. He proceeded to preach and teach and perform miracles in the temple, as it describes right there through the days of unleavened bread in end of John chapter 2. John chapter 3 opens with a man by the name of Nicodemus, who was a ruler of the Jews, a member of the Sanhedrin, a prominent member of the Jewish community. He came privately to Jesus by night. Now, why do you come to somebody privately by night? Because you don't want to be seen publicly by day. He could have sought him out any day at noon right there in the temple, people around. If he wanted to say something, he could have sought him out. He didn't want to be seen talking to him. He wanted to talk to him, but he didn't want anybody to know. He came to him privately by night, and he said, Master, Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher sent from God, for no one could do what you do except God be with you. We know that. You see, John 10 tells us that there were many of the rulers of the Jews, many of the chief rulers who believed on him. They heard his message, they saw his miracles, they knew it was the truth, but they were afraid because the Pharisees, who had control of the synagogues, priests had control of the temple, Pharisees had control of the synagogue. And the Pharisees had already let it be known that they would strip anyone of his position, of his title, of his of all of his official positions. They would throw him out of the synagogue if he confessed that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. They intimidated folks. So Nicodemus came to him privately by night. There were many others who believed, but they were afraid to say anything because the Pharisees had made a threat. And why did that scare them? Because they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. They were more concerned about what people thought. You know, that's a controlling factor in a lot of people's minds. Back in Matthew 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ talked about the things we do. And He talked about when you give alms, when you help somebody that's in need. Or He talked about when you pray or when you fast. And He talked about doing those things privately. Because He said, your Father, your Father sees in secret, and He'll reward you. But if you do those things to be seen of men, He said, don't be like the hypocrites and sound the trumpet before you. Try to call attention, make sure everybody's watching. That's sort of what the Pharisees did. They loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. You know, if the Pharisees had been going to volunteer for some sort of position of service or responsibility, they were glad to have something that everybody noticed. I don't think you'd have found many of them signing up for some job that nobody would have known they did. Something that was behind the scenes. You know, in anything, there's always countless things that go on behind the scenes. There are a lot of things. There are ways of serving. You know, you give to somebody, you help somebody, you do something for someone who's in need. And, you know, people may never know. In fact, most likely they won't unless you tell them. You know, the Pharisees didn't have any interest in projects like that. If they were going to do something, they wanted to make sure the crowd was watching. They loved the praise of men. They liked to be noticed. They wanted to be popular and to be looked to in some remarkable way. You know, that was part of Saul's undoing. It describes it back in 1 Samuel 15. If you remember the account, Saul had been instructed by Samuel, actually God had given, was the source of the instructions, to destroy the Amalekites. Samuel showed up. Saul came out to greet him. Said, well, boy, I've done it this time. I did just what you said. And Samuel said, what's all that lowing of sheep and lowing of oxen and bleating of sheep that I hear? What's all that? I thought you said you destroyed it. Oh, that. Well, now, you see, the people wanted to keep the best. They were going to offer them for a sacrifice. That's what all that is. Samuel said, look, it's better to obey than to sacrifice. And he was very strong with Saul. First, Saul denied having done anything wrong. Then finally, when he got pinned down, he said, well, I've sinned. Now, I feared the people. I kept the sheep and the oxen because I feared the people. Saul wanted to be popular. He didn't want to be the bad guy. And here were instructions that were to be carried out, but those instructions weren't popular. And when Saul realized that they were unpopular, he backed off because he loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. You know, Saul got very jealous of David when David became a hero after the slaying of Goliath. Why was Saul so jealous? Well, people were praising David. He was a hero. Saul became consumed with jealousy. Because, you see, Saul really loved the praise of men. Saul liked attention. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted to be important. He wanted to be popular. That was what he loved. The love of money has led many astray. The love of this present world, being in love with the world, has led yet others astray, loving power and control, loving the preeminence has been the downfall of yet many others. Still others really love the praise of men. They love popularity. They want to be noticed. Yet others, Paul describes in 2 Timothy chapter 3, simply love themselves. 2 Timothy 3, verse 1, "This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God." First and foremost, what do they love? They love pleasure. They love themselves. They're selfish, self-centered, self-indulgent. They love themselves. They want what's convenient. They want what feels good. Notice the contrast to all of this back in the book of Philippians. Philippians chapter 2. Paul talked about what we love. First, Philippians chapter 2, verse 1. "If there be therefore any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any bowels and mercies, fulfill you my joy, that you be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory." That was the attitude of Korah and Dathan and Abiram. They loved the preeminence. Paul was writing here to the church, and he said, "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things." Don't simply be lovers of your own self, but every man also on the things of others. Take note of the needs and desires of other people. "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." Learn to think like Christ thinks, who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery, not something to be seized and grasped and held on to be equal with God, but he made himself of no reputation. He emptied himself. Emptied himself of that glory and power that he had possessed with the Father from eternity. He emptied himself, and he took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. He became a mortal human being, Emmanuel, God with us, but in human flesh, subject to getting hungry and getting tired, subject to being a human being. He emptied himself, took upon him the form of a servant, was made in the likeness of men. Being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. He didn't love the praise of men more than the praise of God. He underwent a degrading, terrible death. Wherefore God also has highly exalted him and given him a name which is above every name. You see, what he wanted was what God had to give him. He trusted God and he looked to the Father. Ultimately, at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow. Things in heaven, things in earth, things under the earth. In other words, not only the angelic beings and those who are alive, but those who are dead and in the grave. Ultimately, every tongue will have to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Wherefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more so in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it's God which works in you, both to will and to do of His own good pleasure. Do all things without murmurings and disputings, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. We are to reflect the mind of Christ, the attitude of complete submission and obedience. Jesus Christ didn't place His love on money and physical material things. You know, Jesus Christ walked on streets of gold. He was surrounded by the most grand, beautiful, rich environment that you or I could imagine. In fact, far above anything we could imagine. When you read about the description of God's throne and things of heaven. Jesus Christ voluntarily turned away from that, turned away from the grandeur and the wealth of the universe, the most stupendous surroundings that could even be conceived. And He was born as a human being, not in a palace surrounded by servants, but in a barn, surrounded by sheep, goats, cattle, maybe a donkey or two. Laid in the manger, laid in the little crib there where the animals normally fed. It had clean straw put in there and a few blankets, and that made His cradle. You see, Jesus Christ had a different set of priorities. And He came as a human being, as a tiny little helpless baby. And He grew up and He matured and He developed. And He ultimately fulfilled His role as Messiah, as Savior. He didn't come setting His love on this present world. Satan offered Him the present world, you remember? In a moment of time, he showed him in vision all the kingdoms of this world and their glory. And he said, if you'll bow down and worship me, I'll give it all to you. It's mine to give to whomsoever I will. And if you will acknowledge me, I'll let you have it. You don't have to go through all this to be King of Kings. I'll give it to you right now. Jesus Christ didn't love this present world. He didn't love the preeminence. He didn't love popularity and power and control. He emptied Himself of the preeminence that was rightly His and took upon Him the form of a servant. He was prepared to get out and wash the disciples' feet, to perform the lowest service. You know, we don't think of it so much in practical terms these days because usually when you and I go somewhere, we ride in a car. And you get out and you walk across a paved parking lot for a few steps and come into the building. But you know, if you've ever taken a long hike, you know when you got, several miles down the road, you came to a stop, your feet were hot and tired. And there's nothing like being able to take your socks and shoes off. You ever, gone on a long hike and you get out to maybe a stream or something and take your socks and shoes off and rest your feet. Well, people back then walked where they went. And I'll tell you what, you walk miles up and down the dusty roads of Judea and Samaria and Galilee. When you got where you were going, there was a very practical custom. And that was the fact when you came into the house and you received a sign of hospitality, was that your shoes were taken and somebody brought out a basin of cool water and they washed your feet. But that's sort of a lowly task. And that was the job that was reserved for generally the lowest servant in the house. I mean, you were the bottom of the totem pole if you had to do the foot washing because anybody who had anybody below them delegated that job. Some jobs people like to delegate. Well, that was one that was generally delegated. And whoever was the bottom of the totem pole, you could pick them out. They were the ones that brought the basin out. And they had to get down there and take somebody's old dirty feet and wash their feet. But it was soothing. It was relaxing. It was an outward sign of hospitality. When the disciples came walking into Jerusalem that day, that afternoon prior to sunset, began the Passover, they came in there and they made the trip down. They'd been staying up a couple of miles away, about 3 miles away in Bethany. And they came walking in and their feet were hot and dusty. It would have felt good, but there weren't any servants there, just 12 of them. None of them offered to wash the others' feet. You weren't going to catch John getting down and washing Peter's feet. And Judas certainly wasn't going to get down and wash James's feet. That thought never occurred to them, never crossed their mind. I mean, why would I want to wash his old dirty feet? Now, it would have felt good. But none of them considered themselves so much below the others that they were willing to perform this lowly service. That's why Jesus Christ sort of embarrassed and shamed them all when He got up from the meal. He sort of waited, They all had the opportunity. None of them volunteered. So here He was. He got up, took off his coat, and grabbed a towel and a basin. He comes around. And they're embarrassed. And Peter, says, You're not going to wash my feet. I can't let you do that. He was embarrassed. The very idea, Jesus, their master, stooping down and performing a lowly task like that. And Jesus said, well, if I don't wash your feet, you don't have any part in me. Peter said, well, go ahead and give me a bath then. Not my feet only, my head and my hands. Just do whatever you need. Christ washed their feet. And He said, you call me Master and Lord. You shall respect and acknowledge me by titles of respect. And He said, that's good and right. Proper that you do that. He said, if I then, your Master and Lord, wash your feet, you need to wash one another's feet. There's an account in the Gospels that Jesus Christ specifically requested to be written down and preserved. Most things you don't see where Christ specifically requested. Now this I want recorded. There's one event that specifically he required to be. He said, I want this one recorded. Remember the account where he went into dinner with one of the Pharisees? And while they were there, this woman came up and she stooped down at his feet and she began to wash his feet with her tears and dry them with the hair of her head. And she took this bottle of precious, expensive ointment worth a year's wages of a laboring man. And she poured it out right there on his feet. And people were scandalized. The Pharisees were outraged at such a thing, that he would permit such an incident. And even the disciples, Judas looked around and said, well, that's pretty wasteful. A lot of this stuff could have been sold and given to the poor. Yeah. Now, John adds in, he said Judas didn't say that because he cared for the poor. It was because he was a thief and he was the keeper of the bag. He figured, if they'd sell it and put the money in the pot, he could skim some off. That was his real motive. So sometimes what people say and what they mean are two different things. It was in the case of Judas. And Jesus said, what this woman has done is going to be written down. It's going to be told wherever the gospel is preached. I want this remembered, what this woman has done. Because you see, she didn't come in with some great thing of what focusing on herself, loving the preeminence, loving the praise of men. She came in prepared to perform a very humble task because she loved much. Christ told her that her sins were forgiven, and the Pharisees were scandalized again. And Christ said, she's forgiven much because she's loved much. She's filled with love. Not love of the self, not love of the praise of men, not love of power and preeminence, not love of the present world, not love of money, but she was filled with the love of God. One of the most fundamental principles in Scripture. What is the first and great commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. Jesus said, any man that comes to me, and loves father or mother, brother, sister, husband, wife more than me is not worthy of me, cannot be my disciple. Can't come to Christ, be His disciple, be accepted by Him, and love someone or something better. The supreme test for Abraham, you remember the account given back in Genesis chapter 22. Abraham had waited years and years for a son. Waited all these years, and finally God appeared and said, you're going to have a son. This time next year, you're going to have a little baby boy. The time passed, and sure enough, little Isaac was born. You can imagine how he was the apple of his father's eye. And as he grew up and was loved and cherished by his elderly parents, and he grew up and he took his first steps and he said his first words, and he became a little toddler and he grew up through childhood and on into adolescence, and the hopes and dreams of those parents were wrapped up in this little boy for whom they had waited decades. And one day, God appeared to Abraham, and He said, Abraham, Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, your son whom you love, and I want you to take him into the land of Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice to me. And we're simply told that Abraham got up the next morning, loaded up, and left. And he went 3 days' journey. And he came there to Moriah, and they proceeded to go up to the mountain. Isaac was carrying the wood. Abraham was bringing the fire. And Isaac looked at his dad and he says, well, now, Dad, we have the wood and we have the fire. But what are we going to offer? What's the sacrifice? And Abraham simply said, my son, God will provide. They got up there on the mountain, and Abraham constructed an altar of stones, and at some point, he had to tell Isaac, you are the sacrifice. And he bound Isaac's hands and laid him upon the altar and lifted his hand with a knife. And just as he was preparing to slay his son, a voice came and said, Abraham, Abraham, don't lay your hand to the lad. Now I know that you fear me. Now I know that you love me more than anything or anyone. Because you know Abraham would have gladly taken his son's place. Abraham would have gladly been the sacrifice in place of his son, but God didn't ask him for his life. He asked him for something he loved far more. He asked him for his sons. But you know, God didn't ask of Abraham what he was unwilling to do himself. Because Abraham named that place. There was a ram caught in a thicket, and that was what the sacrifice was. And Abraham named that place, that hilltop, Yahweh Yireh, which means literally, the eternal will provide. And almost 2,000 years later, on that very spot, God did provide. You see, He so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. Whosoever believes might not perish. That's you and that's me. Brethren, we're going to be living through the culmination of all of the prophecies of the Bible in the years immediately ahead of us. We're going to go through pressure and trial. We're going to go through many tests, many enticements, and many threats. We're going to go through all sorts of things. And ultimately, the way in which you and I individually come through it is going to be contingent on the answer to one question. That question is, what do you love the most?